This vehicle might look familiar because we just did a test drive in it. It's a two-door with an LS 5.3. During the build, the customer questioned about replacing his suspension, and after the build we did, so I'm out on another test drive. And I thought this would be a good time to talk about suspension, because you go out and you spend $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 on a swap and you have this awesome 400 horsepower engine, but it rides like crap. It beats you up on every tar strip and every intersection, and you really can't enjoy your Jeep. The thing about suspension is like everything else, it's give and take. What do you want? What do you need? If the intended use of your JK is a daily driver, you don't go off-road very much, or when you do, you might run some trails, but you don't do a whole lot of technical stuff, then the stock mid-arm suspension is probably okay. And I say mid-arm because a lot of guys call them short arms, but if you look at the TJs and earlier Wranglers, they had even shorter arms than the JK. And one of the advantages of the JK is having those longer factory control arms means you have some options now without having to resort to a long arm right off the bat, and we'll talk about that. And I'm going to try to keep the video short because suspension systems can take up a lot of time. I am not an expert at it. I know when I'm done with a swap, I want it to be safe. I want you to be able to accelerate hard and not torque steer to one side. I want you to brake hard and not torque steer to one side. So we have to determine how much do you need. And some of you might think that, oh, the more travel I have, the better. The suspension system that has the most amount of articulation is the best. And that's not really true, because you can have too much articulation. Too much articulation off-road can cause problems. It can cause you to flip over. When you add a lot of horsepower to a Jeep with floppy suspension, you get on it and get off the throttle, your Jeep could roll around like a houseboat. And that can be dangerous on the highway. If the intended use of your Jeep is a daily driver and you do light off-roading, the stock mid-arm suspension is going to be just fine. If your tire size is 33 inches or less, you probably don't need a lift. Now you might want to go to a Highline fender or even a budget boost if you have 33 or 4 inch tires and you got some fender clearance issues. The new trend I find is keeping the Jeep low and putting Highline fenders on. That keeps the center of gravity low, keeps your off-road performance better. The one thing that you're losing is differential clearance, because the differential clearance is really set by the tire size, not by the amount of lift that you have. Years ago, it was popular to raise your Jeep up 6 inches and put 35s on it and make it look like a monster truck. But there's a lot of disadvantages to that. You're just raising the center of gravity and losing vehicle dynamics for looks. I'll say right off the bat, I'm not a big fan of drop bracket suspension systems. They get the job done. They do keep a stock-like ride. They don't really increase your travel at all. They are raising the roll center. They are raising the center of gravity. So they're just giving you kind of a budget boost type lift, and that works for a lot of people. But if you want to do some serious off-roading, there are some better options in my opinion. And again, like everything else, how much do you want to spend? There's premium suspension systems out there. There's midline suspension systems out there. And then there's low-cost suspension systems out there. My advice is stay away from the low-cost suspension systems. They're not going to ride the way you want. They're not going to handle the way you want. Most of the budget imported suspension systems are going to have a single rate wound spring, so it's going to be stiff all the way through its travel. The joints are going to be harder. They're going to wear out. Pretty much everybody I know that's gone with a budget suspension system hasn't been happy and has upgraded at some point. So I want to talk about the midline suspension systems in this video, because suspension systems can take many videos to describe, and again, I'm not an expert at this, so I want to convey what I think is the best options for our engine conversions. The stock suspension system and axles are fine with most of our swaps. If you've got a 500 plus horsepower engine, you're going to have to upgrade axles, and again, that's going to be another video. Axles will complicate things. There's different types of suspension systems, 3-link, 4-link, throw down, the elite chassis where you have to move the fuel tank, and I'm going to try to stay away from all that in this video. If you guys are interested in talking about those suspension systems, then remark in the comments. So let's talk about the average JK 2 or 4-door. You put 35s to 37s on it. You want a 3-inch lift so those tires can articulate. You want good ride. You want good handling, but you don't want to break the bank. So let's just talk about some of the suspension components, because you can choose a suspension system based on those components rather than a manufacturer's brand. And I will mention a few manufacturer's brands that we've had good luck with, but at the end of the day, it's up to you. So let's start with a control arm. The control arm, there's 8 of them, as you know. These are live axle suspensions. So we have essentially a live axle, like a rear end from an old car, going up and down. Now, I will say that we are light years ahead of where we were 20, 30 years ago. Back in the 70s and 80s, the Jeeps and the Toyotas had live axles with leaf springs all the way around. So it was basically grit your teeth over the tar strips and the stutter bump roads. It was really difficult to make leaf spring suspensions ride well. We used to pull the spring packs out, put nylon shims between them, grease them, put them in motorcycle inner tubes. But the reality is there's a lot of friction there. The leaves have friction between each other. So you're never going to get that ride like you would with a coil. So in the 90s, the Jeeps started to migrate towards live axles and coil springs. And they had some vehicles that had coil springs in front and maintained the leaves in the rear. And the reality is the leaf spring suspension is very solid. It's very sturdy. In a lot of ways, it's more stable than some of the other suspension systems out there, like independent suspension systems. We used to do solid axle swaps, SAS, on some of the independent suspension Toyotas, and it's a very popular thing today in a lot of off-road vehicles because having that live axle means you can go out and beat it up, and it's not going to fail like some of the other systems. The Land Rovers went to air spring suspensions like some of the new Grand Cherokees, and they've always been fragile and heavy off-roading. If we look at the control arm in a JK, the mid-arm, really all it is a rod, a tube, whatever they use to link the axle to the frame. And you say, well, that's pretty simple, and it is, but here's my advice on that. I've had some of these rods that are 1.5 inches, 2 inches in diameter, and they're solid, and they weigh a ton. That's sprung weight, which means every time your suspension goes up and down, you got to move that weight. So you want to get a control arm that's not too heavy, but strong. Obviously, with 4130 chromoly, and I've got some machined aluminum control arms that were, I believe, custom made with nylon sliders on the bottom that are beautiful in my shop, but that's over the top and there's no reason to spend that much money for a daily driver. So what you want to look for is something that's relatively light and strong, so it's constructed out of good steel. Some of the import suspension systems, especially one from China, do not run as good of steel as the US systems do. The second part to the control arm is the finish, and you think that's not that important, but it really is. I've seen some of these cheap suspension systems that look really pretty when you take them out of the box. They've been shot with some kind of lacquer or enamel, but you get them back east, the paint starts to chip, rust gets under it. Before you know it, the thing looks like a boat anchor, and if you let it go too far, it can actually be dangerous. So the higher end suspension systems are going to be powder coated, or I like the metal cloak. I'm not sure if it's iridite or galvanized. I'm not sure what they do, but it's a gold color and it's very weatherproof. I've had them on my Jeep now for almost 10 years and they still look like new when I clean them up. Now, probably the most important part of the control arm is the joint, and I'm not going to get into the joint because it's Ford versus Chevy, but I will give you my opinion on a few types of joints. The Clevites, the Heims, anything that is not a rubber joint has good performance, but you may have to lubricate it, which is usually a mess. They're usually going to wear out and they're going to have to be replaced quite often. If you go with a rubber joint, which is my preference, rubber joints have a lot of advantages in my opinion. One, they can absorb shock. In some cases, we find the rubber joints can handle the horsepower just as good or better than some of the Heim type joints. And that's because the rubber will absorb that shock. It's not metal on metal, it's not metal on plastic, it's rubber. The rubber joint also self-centers the arm. The arm has to be centered so it doesn't clank, clank, clank as the suspension moves around. One of the things suspension manufacturers do is they'll put a rubber joint on one end and then they will run a Heim or Johnny, Clevite, whatever on the other end. And the rubber joint's purpose is to center the arm. Now here's the big downfall to the rubber joint. It's rubber, it's pressed in, and it can only rotate so far before it rips, tears, wears out. So the solution is to go to a longer arm. By going to a longer arm, you're still pivoting at the same point off the frame. Because the arm is longer, you can get more travel with the same rubber joint than you would with the mid or the short arm because it's out further. So while the travel of the arm ends up at the same angle, you've picked up suspension travel. Now, going to a long arm for me is kind of a big step because then you've got to add additional suspension pickup points, the control arm mounts. Sometimes they're pivoted all the way back off the cross member or near it. Usually you have to weld. There are some bolt-in systems, but they're not as solid, and that can get into some technical problems. If you don't weld them in right, a lot of guys don't pull the bodies off and weld the top sides, and water can get in there and rust the brackets away. So if you're going to go to a long arm, it really has to be done correctly. And if it's not done correctly, your vehicle might drive down the road like a crab. By staying with a mid-arm and stock suspension pickup points, you don't have any of that hassle or grief. So you say, well, how can I run a mid-arm and get the travel that I want? And that's a good question. And there's some suspension technology out there that'll let you do that. And I'm going to use the Metal Cloak suspension system as a reference because the guys over at Metal Cloak, Doug, Scott, Will, Mattson, Aaron, they've really pioneered this technology, and we're starting to see that this technology is being copied, and imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So what Metal Cloak did is they took this standard rubber joint and said, okay, we want the properties of rubber so that it absorbs these impacts, it self-centers the arm, and we'd like to have rubber on both sides because that self-centers the arm even better. But what are we going to do about the travel? If we try to get the travel that we want, we're going to rip the joint. So they developed the Duraflex joint. You can go to metalcloak.com and see how that works, but the Duraflex joint essentially allows the rubber insert to rotate in its housing. And it is a rebuildable joint. Now, I will say that I've had them on my Jeep, like I said, for almost 10 years, and I haven't had to rebuild my joints. But you should check with the manufacturer as far as servicing and building these joints. Now, they do use some lube in these joints when you assemble them, but it's not like greasing some of these other joints where grease is coming out everywhere and it's a mess. It's a really clean setup. Uses some clips to hold the rubber joint in. So I think we've covered the arm. You want something that's relatively lightweight, strong, well protected by its coating from the elements, and then run a proper joint. Second thing we'll talk about is the spring. I like to run a variable rate spring. Like I mentioned, most of the cheaper kits are going to come with a single rate spring, so it's going to be stiff all the time. When you hit little bumps in the road, you're going to feel every one of them. It's not going to float over it. There's dual rate springs out there that improve that, but really the variable rate spring is what you want. The variable rate spring is wound in a way that when you go over little bumps, it is very compliant and it absorbs them. But then as the spring compresses, the rate increases. So this still allows you to corner flat and not bottom out like soft springs would do. It's a really good compromise. And when you combine that with the rubber joint and the next thing we're going to talk about, which is the shock absorbers, that's what's going to determine your ride. Well, that's what you think will determine your ride, but there's another important component in this puzzle. You might think shocks are a simple thing, but like everything else, they're not. Now, I drive like an old man, so I like a very compliant suspension. I used to really like the old man Emu shocks because you can take them on a collegiate road and they rode really well. The problem with that is if you want to get out in Johnson Valley and pre-run, you're not going to do it. If you go over those whip-de-doos, you're going to bottom that thing out constantly. Then there's even more variables. There's the up dampening and the down dampening. You can have a shock that rides really stiff on one vehicle. In fact, I have a customer right now, we put an LT1 in his Jeep and it's over 7,000 pounds. It's got pretty much everything you can imagine in that Jeep. Even with the stiffest valving the manufacturer offers, that Jeep was bottoming out. I had a similar expedition vehicle years ago that was so heavy, the customer had to have an ambulance company make him some coil springs to hold the weight up, and that just led to the suspension brackets cracking and breaking off, so it took a lot of work to get it to work properly. But getting back, that same shock in that heavy vehicle may have been stiff in a lightweight JK like the one I'm in. So you really have to valve your shock and be careful of what you pick out. Now I will say that if you have a relatively stock JK, 4-door, 3-inch lift, 35 to 37-inch tires, that's what these systems are built around. So there's probably not a whole lot you got to do. It's probably going to be set up for you. So that covers the shocks, the springs, and the control arm. I highly recommend you run adjustable track bars so you can center your axles. When you lift the Jeep up, it pulls the axles inward. So most of the manufacturers, if they have a 3-inch lift, they're going to extend those control arms to push the wheels back. But having the adjustable control arms will allow you to set your pinion angle also. Now, one of the first lines of defense to a good ride and handling is your tires. No matter what you do with your suspension, the tires are going to be an integral and very important part of that. If you have the best, most compliant suspension you can buy, but then you put tires on there that are from the Flintstones or like rocks, you're going to sacrifice ride. Now, I do have customers with that setup. They've got really good suspension system, but they're running these really gummy, wide 37-inch tires that weigh a lot, and the sidewalls are so stiff, even when you air them down, they don't compress that much. They're not very compliant. And they want that for what they do. They're running rivers, they're running streams, they're climbing rocks, and those tires give them what they want. But they're never going to get the ride like if you were riding an all-terrain. An all-terrain with the soft sidewalls, and they give you a better ride regardless of what suspension system you're running. And that's the kind of ride I prefer. Flip side is those soft sidewalls can get torn up off-road. You can't air those tires down as much. But at the end of the day, when you pick the suspension system you want and you match it to your need, it's really going to make you enjoy your JK better. Now, we just fitted a Metal Cloak Game Changer to this vehicle. It's a 2-door, and as you know, 2-doors are short couples, so they don't ride as well. So we're going to take it on this trail, see how it does, and we'll see you soon.